Hi, I'm Ben. I did a PhD at the University of Bristol, finishing about 3 or 4 years ago or so at this point. I studied something called nano-optics, which is a subfield of nanophysics, which is a subfield of physics, which is a subfield of mathematics. A PhD is often a subject of hardship, of maybe emotional regret, fatigue, exhaustion. This wasn't me. Mine was great. I took a lot away from it, and I really enjoyed every moment of it, arguably. And I think that was a matter of perspective and mindset. Today, what I want to talk about, what I want to explore, is my full experience that I had during the PhD, so that if you are going through the PhD, maybe this is a set of stories to commiserate to. Or maybe if you're thinking about a PhD, this will give you a little bit of the insight into what the process actually looks like, what it feels like, and whether it's right for you, maybe. Now, what I was an experimentalist. The PhD I did was an experimentalist's PhD. I was tasked with developing a new microscopy approach, what later became called interferometric cross-polarization microscopy. After we kind of got the thing actually working, then we were allowed to name it. Essentially, what we were doing was using two orthogonally polarized laser beams, interfering them in a way that allowed us to detect small nano objects. When I signed up to the whole process, what I was really expecting to walk into, and I think what a lot of people expect to walk into when they think of academia, of doing a PhD, of becoming immersed in a set of incredibly clever, fast-paced, fast-thinking individuals, is exactly that. A really dynamic, bohemian kind of paradise where people are thinking deep thoughts, and coming together to share those thoughts and really push forward frontiers of science. That's kind of the dream that I had carved out for myself and told myself since I was about maybe 12, 13, 14, when I was like, oh yeah, I really like the idea of studying physics as hard as I possibly can. When I turned up, what I realized was that the lab I would actually be working in was probably going to be a little bit different. Where I was supposed to be working was in a building called the NSQI, the Nanoscience and Quantum Information Building. Famously, it was lauded as the quietest building in the world. Essentially, what it was designed to do was to isolate any experiments that were occurring within from all of the constant vibration, all of the city noise, all of the trucks driving by, the cars driving by, so that if you were looking at something on close to the atomic scale, those things you were looking at weren't violently shaking around as you were trying to study them. It was a pretty cool building to work in. All of the lab spaces, all of the optical benches, where you typically kind of set up like a very delicate experiment, a heavy set of metal bench work, so that already there is very little vibration. In this building, though, those metal benches were placed on large slabs of concrete, essentially shaped like a T, and under the kind of arms of the T, there were air pistons. And those air pistons suspended these massive slabs of concrete off the floor, so that as you stepped onto the slab of concrete to conduct your experiment, you were as decoupled from the building as humanly possible. Designed at significant cost to the university, for researchers to be able to study interesting things like atoms, like quantum mechanics, up until the point where they decided to build a building next to that building. And for about a 4-year period, they were just violently drilling into the foundations. So we had to move. They kind of kicked us all out. And we moved to a place called Langford. Langford was a vet farm owned by the university. It turns out, being in a small cabin basically in the middle of a field is vibrationally identical to being an 11 million pound state-of-the-art building. So we were actually fine. We could conduct our experiments. I joined a group though, which was a fantastic group. It was run by a guy called Dr. Henkian Gerson, colloquially called the physics Viking, who was an absolutely fantastic supervisor. Favorite thing about him was just his level of academic honesty, which I found kind of disappointingly to be a bit of a rare trait. But essentially, if I asked him a question that he didn't know, his answer was characteristically, let's find out. To which now it felt to me as if no question was something that I couldn't ask. No question was off the table. And that was a really good environment to sit in. It meant that I could ask dumb stuff. And that's a really good mentality to walk into in terms of a group. So at the time, the group consisted of my supervisor, Henkin, a postdoc, and a PhD student. Unfortunately at the time though, and what I kind of didn't really appreciate, is that to do science you actually need funding, you need money. And at that point in time the group really had been struck by pretty hard times. It hadn't been awarded a grant in maybe 3 or 4 years at that point in time, meaning that the group very quickly, within about 6 months of me joining it, shrunk to just myself and Henkian. What I would say is take home number one, take some time before you jump into a PhD to work out exactly what the setup is, to work out how securely they feel in terms of funding. Kind of anything I would argue that you would ask jumping into a startup company. Do you guys actually have money? Do you guys actually know what you're doing? All of those sorts of questions. As a word of wisdom to anyone looking to join such a group in the future, just dig a little bit, lift up the hood and look under it. And I think you'll have a much better time, a much better experience as a result. So what I want to talk about now is the problem with experimental PhDs, particularly where the goal is to develop a new technique, or where the goal is to develop a new set of instrumentation, which was kind of my case. The problem is you need to actually build or develop the technique or the instrument. Then you need to go and do something ideally very interesting to science with it. The first part of doing that process is building something or discovering something or designing something that no one has ever seen before, which it turns out pretty hard. The second part is taking that thing that no one has ever used before or come up with before and doing something in science that no one has ever thought to do with it. And that part is hard too, because that thing that you do with it needs to actually be useful and better than what other people have been doing to study similar sorts of problems. Maybe takeaway 1.1 is if you are going to jump into a PhD, understand the nature of exactly that sort of exactly the sort of the work that you will be doing. There are PhDs that are significantly easier, in inverted commas, to get papers out of. I would argue that getting papers out of a experimentalist instrumentation based PhD is probably one of the hardest tasks you can sign yourself up to. Would I change it in retrospect? I don't know, because I really enjoyed it. But I definitely wish I could have made a more informed decision early on. Anyway, our conclusion as I joined the group after the group had been working for maybe 4 years or so, was that everything they were trying to develop this technique wasn't working. The most memorable experience that I have of that process was maybe 6 to 9 months in or so, where I came into the lab bright and early one morning and Henkin was just standing there, and in one hand he had an Allen key and in the other hand he had a screwdriver, and he essentially said, "We are taking this thing apart and we're going to start from scratch." And I was like, okay, cool. Seems like things are going well. That became my PhD. Unfortunately, most of Henkin's responsibilities, most of my supervisor's responsibilities, kept him in Bristol. So what I thought the PhD was going to be, this, again, bohemian kind of cultural exchange of knowledge that I thought was going to be really exciting and dynamic, turned out to be me and me alone sitting in a small office in the middle of a field in a vibrationally as quiet as we could possibly get it lab, with the lights turned off for about 3.5 years, trying to build this thing from scratch. When people say a PhD can be isolating, I don't think they expected it to be, or at least I didn't expect it to be quite so literal. I thought they meant it would be kind of, oh, it's very isolating because who can you talk to about your difficult research? Not you will be literally 14 miles away from everything you wanted to be close to, in a room with the lights turned off, surrounded by a field of sheep. Whatever. The thing was, and I said it already, like, I actually really enjoyed it. I would argue, every single moment of it. I can't really look back and think there was a moment where I considered calling it quits, because I genuinely enjoyed it. I genuinely enjoyed every second. There's a lot of details now I could go into here. I don't want to make this a technical description of the experience. I spent about maybe 2 years or so redesigning this system, working out everything that had meant that it hadn't worked up until that point in time, and it really did not work up until that point in time, so that we could start maybe doing some interesting science with the thing. I designed the optics, I built the software to take the measurements, I did a whole bunch of wet lab chemistry to actually produce the little samples that we were going to look at. I used a whole bunch of different control measurement techniques. I used like atomic force microscopy. I used electron microscopes. I had a great time. I had a fantastic time. This is what I call the benefit of a kind of heads up versus heads down mentality. What I am exceptional at is a heads down mentality. I love work. I love doing. I love moving the needle. I love making a little bit of progress. Some people are introverts, I would say. Some people recharge by themselves. Some people are extroverts and recharge around other people. What refreshes me is work. The more I do, the more interesting my ideas become, the more kind of the deeper into a subject I allow myself to get, the more I kind of enjoy that whole process. This means that for something like something typically quite grueling, like a PhD, I don't really suffer because I don't really think about it. What is good about this, and I would call this take home number 2, what is good about this whole mentality, this like trust the process, just keep going, get to work, do some work, is that it very reliably kind of sets a set of habits for you, a process for you. And so even things that are very big monumental tasks, things like a 4-year PhD, or in America, a 7-year PhD, don't do an American PhD, that sounds way too long, become easy to chip away at because you're keeping your head down. What's interesting though, is that the PhDs that I have met that enjoyed the process are typically people like myself. People that can do the grind, people that are happy to keep their heads down and chip away at a big task, because they aren't really thinking about the bigger task. They're operating on kind of a day-by-day basis. The PhDs that do spend their time thinking about that, is this right for me? Am I doing the right thing here? Are probably much more worried about the process, and probably as a consequence are much less able to focus and just chip away at small things. But what it does mean is that they're actually thinking about what they should be doing with their lives, which I would argue is a really, really good thing. In a PhD in the UK, you get funded for about 3.5 years or so. The goal really is to submit your thesis, which is kind of the culmination of the PhD, the write-up of all of the work that you have conducted at the end of that time. Otherwise, you are working for free, and there is an unbelievably high rate of attrition if you find yourself in that position. Goal always is write up, submit before that 3.5 year mark hits and you stop being paid to actually be there doing that research. 2 years in, with 1.5 years to go, I did not have a single paper to my name, and I did not really have any sort of an understanding about how I would do anything useful with this technique. Essentially, one day I just woke up and it was as if a dormant for slightly too long little subroutine in my brain had just been like, Ben, what are you doing? And I was like, it was Christmas, I remember. I'd just gone home back to America, and suddenly I just looked around me and I said, the last PhD student almost didn't get their PhD, became very, very, very close to not getting the PhD because they didn't publish any papers, and because all they did was work on this silly technique that I've now been working on for like more than half of my PhD at that point in time. I've fallen exactly into the trap that they did. Another thought that came across my mind was that my group at that point in time was really just myself and Henkian, my supervisor. I'd had a great time, obviously, but I hadn't really focused on turning anything that I was doing into progress that will allow me to kind of continue an academic career as a postdoc, or for Henkian to generate papers, to be able to win grants, to be able to continue his research. So I kind of was immediately struck by the fact that I was letting down a minimum of 2 people in this equation. I needed to refocus. The goal became generate papers, get the PhD, allow funding to come into the group, and really every other thing kind of dissipated. My only goal, my only focus in life became delivery. And because I am not very good at half measures, I literally stopped every single distraction that could stop me from achieving this thing. I mean, literally every distraction that I could think of. Interesting experiments or opportunities to collaborate with other researchers that would be really interesting and set up good long-term relationships for me to maybe get a job in another group. No, not interested. The YouTube videos that I was making at that point in time that I was really enjoying and using as kind of a a hobby that I was slowly building. Does it produce papers? No, well, it doesn't. Like, get rid of it out of my life. Driving back to Bristol each day to go stay in my house to sleep? No, not doing it anymore. I bought a fold-out couch, I put it in the office, and I just started sleeping in the office at night like an absolute mentalist. Some would argue, but I had a goal. And what I actually look back on as the pinnacle of the bit of the PhD that I enjoyed was exactly this process, where suddenly I had crystal clear vision about what I wanted to achieve as a long-term goal. I was like balanced between this, I have this heads up, this is where I want to go, and this heads down capability of I am just delivering. In the remaining 1.5 years, I produced 5 papers, 4 of them first author, 1 of them second author, exactly around the narrative that I had planned, which not entirely sure how I pulled that off, but it all magically came together, and I try not to ask too many questions in case I realized the whole thing was a dream and I'm actually on a drug-fueled rampage through the streets of San Francisco at this very point in time when I think I'm talking to camera. I don't think that's true, but it might be. It came time to write up my thesis. Typically it takes, at least a few months to write one of these things. But I'd built my narrative and I'd only delivered work that perfectly fit into this. I don't know that this is the perfect way to do the PhD, but it's the way I decided was the way that I was going to deliver it. And very much it was a question of stapling these papers together and occasionally writing little bits that kind of explained the why one paper connected to the paper that came after it, and then just submitting the thing. The whole process took me maybe 6 weeks. I submitted that thesis and I waited for that moment of feeling like, I'm done. I did the PhD. That doesn't ever really happen because at that point, I guess also you're not quite done. You still have your Viva, or in America, your thesis defense, which is where you kind of get shouted at by some smart people about what exactly you have worked on over the past however many years you've worked on it. So I submitted the thing anyway, and I waited for this moment of exaltation, and that never really came. And I was like, okay, maybe that comes after the Viva, after the defense. So I waited for the defense. It came about a month later or so. It was pretty uneventful. And by that, I mean, it was literally the worst experience of my life. About 5 minutes in, I guess, because a lot of the work had been published work, and they were like, well, why should we interrogate this? Why don't we just see how many holes this guy has in his knowledge? And that's the game we played. Find the hole in my knowledge, and we found a lot of them. And it was incredibly stressful. I remember about minute 7 into the process, I was just like, I'm so sweaty. Like, why am I so sweaty? It's because I was terrified, number one, but also just being pushed far beyond things that I knew about and trying desperately to coddle together answers to present to arguably the guy that kind of wrote the book about my field. That was a moderately stressful experience, but luckily it was done in about an hour and a half, which was nice. And then I, again, kind of leant back and I thought, okay, does it feel like I've completed a PhD now? Not really. Does it feel like a celebration is happening? Not really. And actually, like, that's kind of how it feels. It's weird. It's 4 years of unbelievably hard work. And then, like, there isn't really like an ending celebratory moment to it. I mean, you go out for a couple drinks with people to celebrate. I think I lasted about an hour before I was like, I think I need to go to bed. I think my brain is broken. And you don't really ever get that final moment of magical like release of like, oh, I am a doctor. But beyond that, really, like, I suddenly had realized that although I was being really proud of myself for this whole sort of heads up mentality thing that I'd suddenly clocked was useful about 2 years into the PhD, I now was at the end of it. And I had failed to have a plan. Like, I'd failed to like project that heads up look around state to anything other than the end goal of the PhD. So although I thought I was casting my vision wide, I wasn't. I'd again like fallen into that trap of like just deliver. And it kind of ended, and I kind of felt a bit rudderless. Because very much when you do a PhD, or the story, the narrative I'd always told myself was, yeah, PhD, postdoc, lectureship, professorship. That's the route. And it turned out at that point in time, nanophysics, my subject area, just wasn't wasn't well funded. There really like weren't any postdoc positions, and I wasn't probably going to get one. So I was like, oh, I got a long list of papers, which is really hard to do out of a experimentalist PhD, and there's literally no one to wave them at. Like, what has happened? The biggest take-home message, the final take-home message, I would argue, because increasingly few PhDs are able to stay within the academic system because there just aren't that many job opportunities. So chances are you will find yourself in the real world. So make sure that along the way you develop the skill sets that allow you to not only be successful in academia, if that is the path that you do go, but more likely successful in the outside world. I hope you found this interesting. I don't know, I thought it was important to share because I see how many people are kind of finding their way through these sorts of things without too much guidance, without too much commiseration, maybe. And yeah, it can be a difficult process, but it's a survivable process. And I would argue at the other end of it, you can you can find yourself in really, really interesting positions if you take the opportunity to create them for yourself. Thanks very much for listening. See you guys next time.